They'll just seem different from people who seem truly at ease. If you're interested in exploring whether you may have experienced emotional deprivation in childhood, the 1993 book, Reinventing Your Life, by Jeffrey Young and Janet Klosko, offers additional information to help people determine if they were emotionally deprived. People often have no idea that they've experienced emotional neglect until the first time they read about it. When these people come to psychotherapy, they typically don't identify themselves as having been neglected, but upon deeper examination, they often have memories that reveal that they didn't feel properly watched over as children. These memories often involve feeling alone and unprotected in potentially dangerous situations, or feeling that parents or caregivers weren't sufficiently concerned about what might happen to them. Often, they simply knew that they needed to be vigilant, watching out for and taking care of themselves. One woman recalled that, as a 4-year-old, she was left alone on a beach for over an hour without her mother trying to find her, and others corroborated this memory. Another person recalled visiting a swimming pool as a young child and staying away from the edge of the pool because she was sure her mother wasn't keeping an eye on her. Again, the self-sufficiency of internalizing children tends to create the impression that they have no needs. They're expected to be okay and get along without anyone watching over them carefully. They may be characterized as old souls, with their parents counting on them to do the right thing. They willingly oblige, playing a role that's overly self-reliant, which often leads to an adult life of overextending themselves for others. Sandra's story. When Sandra was 11, she and her 7-year-old brother were sent to another state to stay with relatives for the summer. With apparently no concern, their mother put them on a bus for a 500-mile overnight journey in which they had to change buses in the middle of the night. Although Sandra felt lost and afraid, she knew she had to protect her little brother. Situations that might make another child panic send internalizers into an intensely focused state while they figure out how to take care of things. As Sandra put it, "My brother was really scared and cried a lot. I was stoic. I knew it was up to me to make the best of it." Bethany's story. Bethany was sent to Brazil one summer as a 10-year-old to be a babysitter for the infant son of her irresponsible older brother and his new young wife. The brother and sister-in-law liked to party and came and went as they pleased while 10-year-old Bethany took care of her baby nephew. When the summer ended, her mother had Bethany stay in Brazil and miss school so that she could keep helping her brother's family. Finally, something seemed to stir in her mother back home, and she went and retrieved Bethany. Her mother was a classic example of a self-preoccupied, emotionally immature parent, blind to the fact that the capable internalizer is still a child and needs to be looked out for. Learning to ignore one's own feelings. Children who had to become tough and handle things on their own may develop a rejecting attitude toward their own feelings. Perhaps they learned to keep distance from painful feelings they knew their emotionally immature parent couldn't help them with. Leah's story. One day in therapy, Leah, who had grown up in an atmosphere of emotional neglect, apologized to me for still being depressed. She was convinced that I found her sadness annoying and exasperating. Leah thought the only thing I wanted to hear was that she was all better, so that I could feel good about myself as a successful therapist. It was hard for her to imagine I could be interested in how she was really feeling. This was a remnant of her childhood, when her emotionally cold and critical mother became clearly irritated anytime Leah expressed her emotions. In response, Leah developed the belief that the best way to connect was to become a likable person with no emotional needs. So she hid her feelings and tried to play a role others would like. Throughout her childhood, Leah tried to be self-sufficient. She often wondered, how can I make myself enough? How can I feel secure? It didn't occur to her that these weren't questions for a child to answer. Only an emotionally attentive parent could have made her feel that being herself was enough. Receiving only superficial support. Another form of neglect occurs when emotionally immature parents give such superficial comfort that they aren't at all helpful to a scared child. One woman remembered that whenever she was scared as a child, she knew she would have to get through it on her own. When I asked whether she remembered ever getting help with her fears, she said, "That feels like a foreign idea to me. It would be nice to know someone understands, but I never felt that way. I don't remember anyone being able to help with the fears I was having. They just said generic things like, 'Oh, you're going to be fine. It's going to be okay,' or 'There's no need to feel that way. You'll feel better soon.' Internalizers are overly independent. Emotional neglect can make premature independence feel like a virtue. Many people who were neglected as children don't realize that their independence was a necessity, not a choice. I've had clients describe this to me in a number of ways, such as, I've always been the one looking out for myself, it's nothing I can't handle myself, I don't like to rely on anyone, and you should be able to do it without anyone else, don't let them see you sweat. Unfortunately, children who become so independent may not learn how to ask for help later in life when it's readily available. It often falls to psychotherapists or other counselors to coax these people into accepting their need for help as legitimate. Internalizers don't see abuse for what it is. Because internalizers look within themselves for reasons why things go wrong, they may not always recognize abuse for what it is. If parents don't label their own behavior as abusive, their child won't label it that way either. Even as adults, many people have no idea that what happened to them in childhood was abusive. As a result, they may not recognize abusive behavior in their adult relationships. For instance, Vivian hesitated to tell me about her husband's anger, saying it was too silly and insignificant to talk about. She then sheepishly told me that he'd broken things when angry, and once threw her craft project on the floor because he wanted her to keep the house neater. As it turned out, Vivian was embarrassed to tell me because she thought I'd say his behavior was normal and tell her she was making a mountain out of a molehill. Another client, a middle-aged man, recounted incidents of childhood abuse nonchalantly, with no recognition of how serious it had been. For example, he said his father once choked him until he wet himself and then locked him in the basement. Recalling that his father had once thrown a stereo set, he admitted that his father might have had a temper. As he spoke, his demeanor clearly indicated that he accepted this behavior as normal. Internalizers do most of the emotional work in relationships. Internalizers put a lot of emotional work into their family relationships. As a reminder, emotional work involves using empathy, foresight, and self-control to foster relationships and get along well with others. In healthy families, parents do most of the emotional work with their children, but when parents aren't coping well, an internalizing child often steps into the parenting gap. This may take the form of being overly responsible, such as caring for younger siblings when parents are swamped with a crisis, or it could mean paying attention to everyone's feelings to see who's upset and needs to be calmed down. Adopting compensatory cheerfulness. Especially when their parents are depressed or emotionally flat, internalizing children may take on a cheerful, lighthearted role, trying to bring happiness and liveliness into an otherwise sober family climate. With their liveliness and good sense of humor, they help others feel that things aren't so bad. One woman described playing such a role this way: I was always the happy one. For example, during the holidays, I'd be the one saying, "Let's put the decorations up." I did it because people in my family were so detached and unenthusiastic. I now realize I was looking for a connection. She was doing a lot of emotional work to get her family to be excited with her, even if it meant she had to single-handedly inject them with the holiday spirit. Doing emotional work for parents. Emotionally immature parents avoid emotional work if they can. As a result, they may not deal with their children's emotional or attention problems or difficulties at school, leaving the children to flounder on their own. When their children need emotional support, these parents are especially unhelpful. For example, they may be dismissive when their child feels hurt or rejected by peers. Instead of trying to understand their child's social predicament, they toss out useless or flippant advice. Ultimately, children learn that these parents simply won't do any emotional work to help them with their hurt feelings. Furthermore, internalizers' natural sensitivity prompts them to do emotional work for their parents. Sometimes the internalizing child's emotional work even extends to parenting the parent, listening to them, offering reassurance, and even giving advice. These children can get roped into playing the role of emotional support person long before they're mature enough to do so. Worse, sometimes a parent dumps painful emotional issues on a child, but then brushes off any advice the child tries to give, a role reversal that can continue long into adulthood. In addition to being a no-win situation, this demands excessive emotional work from the child. Candace's story. From childhood and into adulthood, Candace had provided a listening ear for her mother's chronic relationship problems. When I asked how she came to play this frustrating role with her mother, Candace said, "I know I'm more emotionally stable than she is. I'm used to handling my own issues without my mother's help. She's definitely the neediest one in our relationship. She needs my encouragement to stand up for herself. She's always had an issue about feeling unlovable. Her self-esteem isn't there. I'm just trying to help her find happiness." Overworking in adult relationships. Many internalizing children optimistically believe that when they grow up, they'll be able to single-handedly love another person into a good relationship. Reflecting on her failing marriage, one woman put it this way: "I thought I could be enough for both of us." Internalizers are accustomed to supplying most of the empathy and doing more than their fair share in trying to get along, and for a long time they may not notice that they're getting worn out while the other person isn't changing at all. Internalizers sometimes take up emotional slack by playing both parts in their interactions with people. They act as if there's reciprocity when there isn't. For instance, they might thank someone for being patient when they are actually the ones being inconvenienced, or they might repeatedly reach out to self-centered people with a thoughtfulness they never get back. They are so familiar with supplying the sensitivity that was missing in their family members that they automatically do this with everyone. They make up for other people's lack of engagement by seeing them as nicer and more considerate than they really are. One man told me about an optimistic fantasy he had regarding his girlfriend, saying, "I thought I could somehow be so wonderful that she could feel something for me that doesn't come to her naturally. I was sure I could make her happy and make her love me." He'd believed that his girlfriend's feelings were something he could change. A female client revealed how much extra emotional work she did in all her friendships. "My problem is that I always try to be nice and accommodating. If I think about what I want or need, I worry that others will think I'm uncaring or trying to be mean. I feel like I have to be concerned about them all the time or I'm a bad person." Another woman only realized after her divorce how much emotional work she'd been doing in the relationship. "When my husband would get worked up over small things, instead of telling him, 'That's completely ridiculous,' I tried to calm and accommodate him. He was so emotionally inept. How did I miss that for 10 years? I didn't see how much effort I was putting in. Instead, I told myself, we are both trying to make this work. I thought maybe I wasn't a good enough wife and wondered what I could do differently, what I could do to improve things. I figured that everyone struggles and maybe this was just what marriage is like." Why do internalizers so often end up in lopsided relationships where they do more than their fair share of the emotional work? One reason is that needy externalizers tend to pursue warm and giving internalizers. Initially, they make the internalizer feel special in order to secure the relationship, but once they have the person, they stop doing the emotional work of reciprocating. The internalizers are surprised at this turnaround and often blame themselves. Attracting needy people. From an early age, internalizers can seem so self-contained that emotionally immature people can't resist leaning on them. Internalizers are so perceptive and sensible that even people they've never met before may instinctively trust them in a stressful situation. My client Martine described it this way: "I'm the go-to person for support and an ear, the voice of calm and wisdom. People don't get that kind of response much, so they flock to me like I'm a dumping ground for their problems. I'm just trying to be a good friend and supportive person, but it encourages people to put too much of their stuff on me. This is something that happens to me a lot." Without even knowing it, people like Martine exude an aura of kindliness and wisdom that's powerfully attractive to needy people. Fortunately, Martine eventually did realize that, for her own good, she needed to be more selective about extending her natural empathy and altruism. As she stopped giving her time and attention indiscriminately, she gained more energy for her own life. In the course of therapy, another client finally realized how widespread her automatic caretaking had become, extending even to people she didn't know. She found herself engaging with chatty strangers in elevators and lonely passerby who tried to strike up unwanted conversations. "Do I have a sign around my neck?" she wondered. She felt obligated to give everyone a warm response, doing emotional work even for people she'd never seen before. And the fact is, needy strangers will gobble up a sensitive person's attention if given half a chance, whether on an airplane, in an elevator, or while waiting in line. Believing that self-neglect will bring love. Many internalizers subconsciously believe that neglecting oneself is a sign of being a good person. When self-absorbed parents make excessive claims on their child's energy and attention, they teach them that self-sacrifice is the worthiest goal, a message that internalizing children are likely to take very seriously. These children don't realize that their self-sacrifice has been pushed to unhealthy levels due to their parents' self-centeredness. Sometimes these parents use religious principles to promote self-sacrifice, making their children feel guilty for wanting anything for themselves. In this way, religious ideas that should be spiritually nourishing are instead used to keep idealistic children focused on taking care of others. Children don't inherently know how to protect their energies. They must be taught how to engage in good self-care, something that happens when adults pay attention to the needs and reinforce the fact that they need rest, sympathy, and respect. For example, sensitive parents teach their children to notice and identify their fatigue, instead of making them feel anxious and lazy for needing to rest. Unfortunately, emotionally immature parents are so self-focused that they don't notice when their children are getting overwhelmed or trying too hard. They're more likely to take advantage of a child's sensitive, caring nature rather than protect the child from overusing it. And if parents don't teach their children about good self-care, in adulthood those children won't know how to keep a healthy emotional balance between their needs and the needs of others. This is especially the case with internalizers. Because of their attunement to others, they can get so focused on other people's issues that they lose sight of their own needs and overlook how the emotional drain is harming them. In addition, they are secretly convinced that more self-sacrifice and emotional work will eventually transform their unsatisfying relationships, so the greater the difficulties, the more they try. If this seems illogical, remember that these healing fantasies are based on a child's ideas about how to make things better. As children, internalizers tend to take on the role self of the rescuer, feeling a responsibility to help others even to the point of self-neglect. Their healing fantasy always involves the idea, it's up to me to fix this. What they can't see is that they've taken on a job nobody has ever pulled off, changing people who aren't seeking to change themselves. It's hard for internalizers to give up the fight to be loved, but sometimes they eventually realize that they can't single-handedly change how another person relates to them. They finally feel resentment and begin to withdraw emotionally. When an internalizer ultimately does give up, the other person may be caught off guard, since the internalizer had continued to reach out and try to connect for so long. Summary: internalizers are highly perceptive and extremely sensitive to other people. Because of their strong need to connect, growing up with an emotionally immature parent is especially painful for them. Internalizers have strong emotions, but shrink from bothering other people, making them easy for emotionally immature parents to neglect. They develop a role self that's overly focused on other people, along with a healing fantasy that they can change others' feelings and behaviors toward them. They get by on very little support from others and end up doing too much emotional work in their relationships, which can lead to resentment and exhaustion. In the next chapter, we'll take a look at what happens when internalizers' true self finally wakes up and they see that they've been giving too much. Chapter 7: Breaking Down and Awakening. This chapter describes what it's like for people to wake up from an ill-fitting role they've been playing for too long. This awakening stage often starts with a sense of failure or loss of control. Painful symptoms like depression, anxiety, chronic tension, or not sleeping can all be signals that old strategies to rewrite reality have become unsustainable. These psychological and physical symptoms are a warning system telling us that we need to get back in sync with who we are and how we really feel. What is the true self? The concept of the true self goes all the way back to ancient times when the idea of having a soul first arose. Human beings have always felt the presence of a genuine inner self that sees and experiences everything but stands a little apart from what we do in the outside world. This self is the source of our unique individuality and is unaffected by the family pressures that mold our role selves. This inner self has been known by many names, such as the true self, the real self, the core self, but all are the same thing, the consciousness that speaks the truth at the center of a person's being. You can think of the true self as an extremely accurate, self-informing neurological feedback system that points each individual toward optimal energy and functioning. The physical sensations that accompany experiencing the true self suggest that whatever this self is, it's based in our biology as human beings. It's the source of all gut feelings and intuition, including immediate, accurate impressions of other people. We can use fluctuations in the energy of our true selves as a guidance system to tell us when we're in alignment with a life path that fits us well. When we're in accord with our true selves, we see things clearly and feel that we're in a state of flow. We become focused on solutions instead of problems. Things seem much more possible as we pay attention to our genuine needs and desires. Opportunities and people come into our lives that help us in ways we never imagined. We actually become luckier. What does the true self want? Your true self has the same needs as a flourishing, healthy child: to grow, to be known, and express itself. Above all, your true self keeps pushing for your expansion, as if your self-actualization were the most important thing on earth. To this end, it asks for your acceptance of its guidance and legitimate desires. It has no interest in whatever desperate ideas you came up with in childhood regarding a healing fantasy or role self. It only wants to be genuine with other people and sincere in its own pursuits. Children stay in alignment with their true self if the important adults in their lives support doing so. However, when they're criticized or shamed, they learn to feel embarrassed by their true desires. By pretending to be what their parents want, children think they found the way to win their parents' love. They silence their true selves and instead follow the guidance of their role selves and fantasies. In the process, they lose touch with both their inner and outer reality. Exercise. Awakening your true self. Whether you're an internalizer or an externalizer, if you've been asleep to your deepest needs, your true self will use emotional symptoms to wake you up so you can start taking care of yourself. Your true self wants you to have the peace of living in accordance with reality. The trick is to recognize these signs of distress for the lifesavers they are. This exercise will help you become more conscious of your true self. You'll need a single piece of paper and a pen. Fold the piece of paper lengthwise down the middle so you can only see one half of the page at a time, then write a heading on each half: my true self and my role self. First, orient the paper so you only see the half with the heading, my true self. Then think back to yourself as a child. Go deep and be honest. What were you like before you started trying to be someone else? Before you learned to judge and criticize yourself, what did you enjoy doing? What made you feel good? If you could be the person you really are and didn't have to worry about money, what would your life be like right now? I recommend looking back to who you were before 4th grade. What were you interested in? Who were your favorite people, and what did you like about them? If you had free time, what did you like to do? How did you like to play? What was your idea of a perfect day? What really raised your energies? Write down your thoughts about this in no particular order as they come to you, beneath the heading, my true self. When you finish that list, flip the paper over to the half with the heading, my role self. Contemplate who you've had to become in order to feel admired and loved. Are you now involved in things that you aren't really interested in? What do you make yourself do because you think it means you're a good person? Are there people you are involved with who deplete your energy and make you feel drained? What are you spending time on that's boring to you? How would you describe the social role you try to play? How do you hope others see you? Which of your personality traits do you try to cover up? What are you glad nobody knows about you? When you finish, put the piece of paper away for at least a day, then open it up, smooth it down the middle, and compare the two sides. Are you primarily living from your true self, or is your role self dominating your life? Breaking down in order to wake up. People experience a breakdown when the pain of living in role selves and healing fantasies begins to outweigh any potential benefits. Most psychological growth exposes some distressing truths about what we've been doing with our lives. Psychotherapy and the like are aids to help us become aware of truths we already know in our bones. When you're going through a breakdown, a good question to ask is what is actually breaking down. We usually think it's ourself, but what's typically happening is that our struggle to deny our emotional truth is breaking down. Emotional distress is a signal that it's getting harder to remain emotionally unconscious. It means we're about to discover our true selves underneath all that story business. Your true self wants you to see what's really going on. It tries to wake you up because it wants you to stop believing that your emotionally immature parents knew what was best for you and that creating a role self is better than being who you really are. It knows better than to let a fantasy run your life. Developmental psychologist Jean Piaget observed that in order for people to learn anything new, their old mental pattern must break up and rework itself around the new incoming knowledge. This process of internal breakdown and accommodation is key to continuing intellectual development. Likewise, Polish psychiatrist Kazimierz Dabrowski theorized that emotional distress is potentially a sign of growth, not necessarily illness. He saw psychological symptoms as coming from a freshly activated urge to grow and coined the term positive disintegration, to describe times when people break down inside in order to reorganize into more emotionally complex beings. Dabrowski noticed that some people were able to expand their personalities as a result of these upheavals, while others soon slipped back to where they'd been before. He observed that psychologically unaware people weren't likely to change much after an emotional upheaval. Other people, however, seemed to take periods of distress as opportunities to learn about themselves, meeting challenging emotional conditions with curiosity and a desire to learn from them. Dabrowski felt that these people had a developmental potential that pushed them toward becoming more competent and autonomous. Dabrowski believed that individuals who can tolerate negative emotions tend to have the highest developmental potential, and saw negative emotions as the driving force behind much of human psychological development, since the discomfort these feelings cause can motivate ambitious people to find solutions. Instead of shutting down or getting defensive when faced with difficult experiences, people with developmental potential try to discover a deeper understanding about themselves and reality. To this end, they're willing to engage in self-reflection, even if this entails painful self-doubt. Although the uncertainty inherent in this process of self-examination can create the byproducts of anxiety, guilt, or depression, tackling these deep questions ultimately yields a stronger, more adaptive personality. Eileen's story. My client Eileen found support and validation in Dabrowski's ideas. An insightful woman, she had benefited greatly from psychotherapy over the years. Her love of learning made her want to understand herself and other people, but her family saw that kind of psychological interest as a sign of maladjustment. When Eileen sought therapy after a very destructive love affair, her family thought she was being ridiculous and labeled her the sick one. Rather than seeing that Eileen was using her emotional pain as a tool for growth and self-understanding, they wondered why she was wasting so much time and money rehashing the past. Eileen knew she was doing the right thing by coming to therapy, but worried that maybe she was the sick one in the family. At one level, she knew better, based on her awareness of her parents' immaturity, impulsivity, and avoidance of emotional intimacy, but it still seemed odd to her that she was the only family member who felt the need for help. Learning about Dabrowski's idea of positive disintegration helped Eileen see her distress as growing pains, and once she knew about Dabrowski's growth theory, she felt proud of herself for being the only person in her family willing to explore her distress in order to find a healthier way of being. Waking up from an outdated role self. People often keep playing their childhood role self far into adulthood because they believe it keeps them safe and is the only way to be accepted. But when the true self has had enough of the role playing, people often get a wake-up call in the form of unexpected emotional symptoms. Virginia's story. Virginia's wake-up call came in the form of a sudden onset of panic attacks that occurred when she felt criticized by her tyrannical and judgmental older brother, Brian. Virginia had always worried constantly about what people thought of her, so much so that social events were exhausting triathlons of reading other people, trying not to give offense, and imagining imminent rejection. At work, she miserably obsessed over how people saw her. Virginia came to therapy to get a grip on her panic, and did, but she also ended up realizing how unaccepted she'd felt as a child. Through therapy, Virginia realized that Brian had the same disapproving manner as their deceased father, who had always left Virginia feeling inept and unloved. She began to understand that her social anxiety was a reflection of her childhood role, in which she repeatedly and unsuccessfully tried to win the love of her critical and disdainful father. Her subconscious healing fantasy was that one day she would finally be correct enough to gain his approval. She had unconsciously taken on the role of playing the scared, inadequate child to her father's wise and powerful persona, and now Brian was his stand-in. Virginia's anxiety attack signaled that she was beginning to question her childhood belief that the authority figure is always right. She told me, if people expressed any displeasure with me, especially men, I got frightened and automatically assumed I must be wrong. But now she was able to see her relationship with Brian more clearly. I've been putting him on a pedestal, like he's some kind of god. He doesn't care about me, yet I let him determine whether I felt good or not. I've always been so concerned about his opinion, but now I'm getting a bit more self-contained. I feel as if I'm just learning to be an individual. Without the wake-up call of her panic attacks, Virginia might have just kept on deferring to others in a cloud of self-deprecating anxiety. Her panic attacks ushered in a new consciousness in which she no longer needed to accept the story of male infallibility she'd been indoctrinated with as a child. a story that had been destroying her self-esteem as an adult woman. Her role self of being the weak and confused little girl collapsed as she realized that she could choose whether she wanted contact with Brian or not. She could finally be aware of how she really felt about her father and brother, who jointly had made her the least important member of the family. The spell was broken. Exercise. Releasing yourself from a self-defeating role. Take a moment now to write a short personality description of someone in your life who makes you feel nervous or small. Next, think about how you behave around that person, and then write a short description of the role self you've been playing with the person. See if you can spot a healing fantasy that might be driving you to seek this person's acceptance at all costs. How much time have you spent wishing this person would act differently toward you? Do you think you might be playing out a self-effacing role that no longer serves you? Are you ready to see yourself differently and relate to this person as you would to anyone else? Waking up to what you really feel. Sometimes giving up a healing fantasy of how we will finally win love means we have to face unwanted feelings about people close to us. Many of us tend to feel guilty and ashamed for feelings we deem to be unacceptable. We're convinced that the only way to be a good person is to repress these feelings. However, if we quash our real feelings for too long, they may bubble up in ways that force us to stop and look at what's wrong. Tilda's story. Tilda had so much to feel grateful for that she couldn't stop feeling guilty. She'd been born to a single mother who did domestic work to support them both. Her mother, Kasia, had come to the United States from Sweden to make a better life for her child. She scraped together every cent she could earn so that Tilda could get a good education. Tilda had taken full advantage of her opportunities and eventually earned an advanced degree in graphic design on a scholarship. She was nearing the end of her training when she came to see me for an episode of major depression. Although she was still able to work, every morning began with a struggle to take action. As soon as she got out of bed, she longed to crawl back under the covers. We traced the onset of her depression to phone calls to her mother, who was becoming increasingly petulant and bitter as Tilda neared completion of her studies. Kasia had always been emotional and never let Tilda forget how she single-handedly raised her after being abandoned by Tilda's father and coming to the United States. In every conversation, Kasia complained about physical ailments and people who had recently done her wrong. Tilda was sympathetic, and besides, she felt she owed her mother everything, but the strain of listening helplessly to Kasia's angry misery was wearing her down. Tilda felt that nothing she said to her mother ever seemed to help. I asked Tilda how she felt when Kasia brushed off her sympathy and continued with her complaints. At first, Tilda would only say how guilty she felt for not being able to make her mother feel better, and what a bad daughter she was for enjoying her life while Kasia suffered. But when I persisted and asked how it felt in her body when she heard her mother's voice, Tilda finally let herself feel it. She looked stunned as she identified the feeling. "I don't like her," she said in a whisper. This was Tilda's emotional truth, which had been at war with her childhood healing fantasy of finally giving Kasia enough love to make up for her disappointing life. Tilda's exaggerated guilt and gratitude had prevented her from experiencing her true emotions about her mother. The ironclad family story was that Kasia had sacrificed everything and therefore deserved Tilda's total attention and devotion. When Tilda began to resent her mother's ceaseless complaining, her guilt turned her own unacknowledged anger into depression. Tilda's depression lifted as soon as she accepted her genuine feelings toward Kasia, finally allowing herself to know that she didn't like her mother, even though she was grateful to her, released her from an impossible bind. She realized that she could still have contact with her mother, but that she didn't have to pretend to feel the right way. Exercise. Exploring whether you have hidden feelings. You can do this exercise anytime you're feeling especially anxious or in a down mood. At those times, ask yourself whether you might be harboring some hidden feelings. Consider the times when you feel worst and see if they're related to thinking about a certain person. In my experience, the two feelings people seem most reluctant to admit are being afraid of someone or not liking someone. As you think about how to put your suppressed feelings about this person into words, I recommend speaking as a fourth grader might, using simple, clear sentences. Also, work on this in a private place so you don't have to worry about other people's reactions. Then let yourself speak or whisper your honest truth out loud. You might try a phrase like, "I don't like it when this person," describing their behavior. When you hit upon your true feelings, you'll feel a release of tension or sense of relief in your body. Don't let guilt inhibit you. You're speaking only to yourself, for the purpose of self-discovery. No one can hear you, and it's completely safe. Some people think it's necessary to confront the other person to get a true resolution, but I believe this is often counterproductive and provokes too much anxiety. Disclosing feelings too soon may flood you with unnecessary anxiety, not to mention risking a backlash when you're just beginning to get in touch with your true feelings. You can always talk to the person later if you wish, but first you need to regain your ability to speak your feelings to yourself. Just to be clear, what helps isn't telling the other person, it's knowing what you really feel. Simply admitting your true feelings and stating them out loud can make a huge difference in regaining your emotional peace. Waking up to anger. Because anger is an expression of individuality, it's the emotion that emotionally immature parents most often punish their children for having. But anger can be a helpful emotion because it gives people energy to do things differently and lets them see themselves as worthy of sticking up for. It's often a good sign when overly responsible, anxious, or depressed people begin to be consciously aware of feeling angry. It indicates that their true self is coming to the fore and that they're beginning to care about themselves. Jade's story. Jade used to feel bad about herself for feeling angry so often, especially because her anger was often directed toward her parents. For years she thought the answer was to pretend not to have those feelings. Secretly, Jade worried that she was a malcontent who got irritated for no good reason. But Jade's anger seemed to have its roots in how her dismissive and emotionally unengaged parents ignored her feelings. When Jade finally started thinking about her anger in terms of her emotional needs being neglected, she was able to see it differently. Now I think there would be something wrong with me if I weren't angry. There are plenty of reasons why I'm angry, and my anger is coming right from my core self. It's very empowering to be angry. I don't want to live a lie anymore. It's been lonely and disappointing trying to relate to my parents. Being with them is isolating. After accepting her anger, Jade could see her healing fantasy clearly for the first time. She had thought she could heal her family by being extremely loving. Here's how she put it. I tried to see everybody as good. I thought everyone loved one another. I was naive. I thought that if you were nice to people, at the end of the day things would get fixed. I thought that my parents would actually love me and that my brother and sister might care about what I'm interested in. But now I've learned that I need to do what's right for me and trust myself. I really do enjoy my own company. I don't want to waste my time anymore. I hope I'll find people I can trust. I'm not going to try to make it work with people who are distant or unsupportive. I'll be cordial and polite, but I'm not moving in close just to be disappointed. Waking up to better self-care. Internalizers are notorious for not taking good care of themselves. Believing it's up to them to improve or fix everything, they often end up neglecting their own health, especially the need for rest. As they work to attend to everything they think they need to do, they often overlook even basic physical cues, including pain and fatigue. Lena's story. Lena lived a very pressured life in spite of her best efforts to keep things simple. She always felt like she was running out of time. It was as though there was a voice in her head that constantly told her to keep pushing herself and that her efforts were never adequate. Even pleasurable activities like playing the piano became marathons in which she had to overcome laziness and do her best. She never gave herself a break until she was completely spent. In addition to working feverishly at her full-time job, her life was dictated by the demands she constantly perceived from others, down to her pets and the birds she fed in her yard. A drooping plant could fill her with guilt for not watering it sooner. When Lena took an exercise class to help her relax, she wore herself out trying to keep up and do everything perfectly. During the class, she told herself, I should be able to do this. This is baby stuff. The next morning, she woke up unable to think or function very well, but didn't realize she had overdone it until she tried to go up some steps, at which point she found that she was so sore she could hardly lift her legs. Lena had a long-standing habit, promoted by her demanding mother, of ignoring her body's cues about fatigue. As a child, if she didn't get things done quickly enough or work hard enough, her mother chastised her for being lazy. As a result, she had never done things at her own pace and was insensitive to her physical limits. Lena had been trained to believe that being a good person meant straining to achieve, even if that meant always being a little off balance and never quite ready. In Lena's quest for her mother's approval and love, she had developed the belief that she was only worth something when she was trying really hard. Her childhood healing fantasy was that one day she would try so hard that her mother would be transformed from a perennially dissatisfied taskmaster into an appreciative parent who recognized how hard her daughter was working to please her. Lena's all-out efforts were also encouraged by society in general through cultural maxims like try your hardest, never give up, or always do your best. For an overly motivated person like Lena, such messages are mind poison. It's unnecessarily exhausting to always try your best. It's more sensible to know when to do your very best and when not to. Fortunately, once Lena realized what her healing fantasy was doing to her, she was able to reset her values and take her own needs into account. Waking up through relationship breakdowns. Relationship problems present a huge opportunity to wake up. Given that we tend to play out painful patterns learned in childhood in our significant adult relationships, it isn't surprising that so many people come for therapy because of relationship issues. And because intimate adult relationships are so emotionally arousing, they tend to activate unresolved issues about not getting our emotional needs met. We often project issues about our parents onto our partners. Then we may become even more angry with them because, at an unconscious level, they remind us of the past in addition to whatever is happening in the present. Mike's story. Mike had recently hit rock bottom after cutbacks in his work hours and a divorce that left him nearly penniless. His life had been entirely about being a success in the eyes of other people, especially his wife and his mother. Now, in therapy, he was working hard to identify values more in keeping with his true self. In the process, he was beginning to appreciate himself for who he was, including his unique strengths and talents. As Mike reflected on his past, he said, "I didn't make decisions based on how I felt. I made decisions based on what other people wanted. I've been doing this for 35 years, including enduring a loveless marriage, and I have nothing to show for it. But maybe I wanted my recent problems to happen. Maybe I was hoping things would crumble. I've been beaten up, torn down, and humiliated, and now I'm about to be laid off, but I'm telling you, I'm happy." In spite of his material losses and disappointments, Mike could finally drop the healing fantasy that he would be loved if he took care of everybody else at his own expense. The enormous financial debt he incurred due to his divorce was a fitting metaphor for what it had cost him to be someone he wasn't for so many years. Realizing how desperate he had been to be accepted by others, Mike said, "I didn't think I was as good as other people." Then he looked at me, smiled, and asked, "So how to define a successful person?" Answering his own question, he said, "I guess first of all, you get rid of success, and then you see who you are as a person." Waking up from idealizing others. One of the hardest fantasies to wake up from is the belief that our parents are wiser and know more than we do. It can be embarrassing and even scary for children to see their parents' weaknesses, and even as adults, people may strongly resist seeing their parents' immaturity for what it is. It can feel better to remain naive about their limitations than to look at them objectively. Subconsciously, perhaps we feel protective of our parents' vulnerability. Patsy's story. My client Patsy was clearly more emotionally mature than either her impulsive husband or her petulant mother, who lived with her. However, Patsy recoiled when I observed that she seemed to be the most mature person in her family. "Oh, I don't like to think that," she objected. She said such a thought felt disloyal and that she didn't think of herself as special or superior in any way. Although humility can be a nice quality, it wasn't doing Patsy any good because she was using it to ignore a glaring reality. Idealizing her mother and husband wasn't helping her, nor was denying her own strengths. Once Patsy was able to accept that she had more maturity than her husband or mother, she could be more objective about their behavior. She stopped attributing positive qualities to them that they didn't have, and was able to set limits with them. She also stopped wasting energy pretending she was less than she was, so that they could pretend to be more than they were. Waking up to your strengths. It's important for people to consciously appreciate their strengths. Unfortunately, the children of emotionally immature parents usually don't develop much appreciation for their positive qualities because self-involved parents have little or no ability to reflect their child's strengths. As a result, these children often feel a little embarrassed to think of themselves in terms of their most positive qualities. They're accustomed to putting others in the limelight and worry that they'll get a swelled head if they recognize their own strengths. However, it's crucial to know what your assets are and be able to articulate them. It provides self-validation and allows you to feel good about what you bring to the world. This self-recognition builds energy and positivity. While modesty and humility can help you keep things in perspective, they shouldn't prevent you from knowing your best qualities. Waking up to a new set of values. Family therapist and social worker Michael White developed a form of psychotherapy known as narrative therapy. His approach was founded on the idea that it's crucial for people to become conscious of the meaning and intentions in the storylines they've been living by. In the process of uncovering a client's life story, the therapist works to expose the often self-neglectful values people have been living by, and then invites them to update their guiding principles, choosing new values more consciously. Aaron's story. Aaron was a strong, silent type who had always lived by a code that involved not pushing for recognition. Growing up, he loved theater and acting, but he never spoke up to request a role or ask a director for a bigger part. He thought he would seem spoiled and demanding if he promoted himself, and that lobbying for himself was a sign of weakness. However, as an adult, Aaron began to see that his code of not speaking up for himself often resulted in other people being put ahead of him. In addition, others often took advantage of his talents without reciprocating. He saw that his healing fantasy, in which he hoped authority figures would spontaneously recognize his potential, wasn't coming to fruition. So he decided to develop a new value of going after what he wanted. He started actively seeking opportunities and laying claim to them. Considering a job change, he said, "In the past, I would have been reluctant to do this for myself, but now I'm not." He finally saw himself as worthy of standing up for and investing in. Waking up by getting free of childhood issues. Working through childhood emotional injuries is the most effective way of waking up from repeating the past. When I say working through, I mean the mental and emotional process of coming to grips with painful realities. Think of it as a process of breaking down something that's initially too big to swallow. You chew on it until it can become a digestible part of your history. Research suggests that what has happened to people matters less than whether they've processed what happened to them. In a study of the characteristics of parents who raise securely attached children, researchers found that parents who created a secure attachment for their children were often characterized by a willingness to recall and talk about their own childhoods. Even though some of these parents had lived through very difficult childhood experiences, their relationships with their own children were secure, since they had spent time thinking about and integrating their childhood experiences and were at ease with both the negative and positive aspects of their past. It's easy to imagine why children with such parents showed secure attachment. These parents were not avoiding reality. Because they had addressed their own pasts, they were fully available to connect with their children and form a secure attachment. Summary. The true self will find ways of expressing itself, even in the face of efforts to play a role or live out a healing fantasy. When people have ignored their true self for too long, they may develop psychological symptoms. Waking up to the needs of the true self can initially feel like breaking down. Panic, anger, and depression are just a few symptoms that may signal an emotional awakening to better self-care and healthier values. When people process their childhood issues and wake up to their strengths, they gain the confidence to start living from their true self. In the next chapter, we'll explore how you can use this new objectivity and self-awareness to interact with emotionally immature family members in a new way. Chapter 8. How to avoid getting hooked by an emotionally immature parent. It's hard to see our parents as fallible human beings. As children, we believe our parents can do anything. Although adolescence and the independence of adulthood can weaken our view of our parents as all-powerful, they don't eradicate it. Therefore, even if they aren't loving, we wishfully think they could be if they wanted to. Certain cultural tenets also keep us from seeing our parents clearly. Most of us are instilled with beliefs such as these. All parents love their children. A parent is the one person you can trust. A parent will always be there for you. You can tell your parents anything. Your parents will love you no matter what. You can always go back home. Your parents only want what's best for you. Your parents know more than you do. Whatever your parents do, they're doing it for your own good. But if your parents were emotionally immature, many of these statements may not be true. In this chapter, I'll help you look beneath the surface of your childhood hopes and cultural assumptions in order to see your parents more accurately. You'll be learning a new way to relate to them, so you won't expect what they can't give. You'll learn how to protect your emotions and individuality by approaching your parents in a more neutral way, a way they can tolerate emotionally. But first, let's look at a common fantasy that often prevents people from relating to their parents in a realistic way. The fantasy that a parent will change. A common fantasy among children of emotionally immature parents is that their parents will have a change of heart and finally love them by showing concern. Unfortunately, self-preoccupied parents refuse all invitations to fulfill their part in their child's healing story. Focused on their own healing fantasy, they expect their children to make up for their childhood hurts. Seeking their parents' healing love, many people hop around after their parents like hungry birds, trying to elicit a crumb of positive response from them. In adulthood, these children often learn a variety of healthy communication skills and hope that these skills will improve their relationship with their parents. They think they might finally have the techniques necessary to draw their parents into a rewarding interaction. Annie's story. Annie's mother, Betty, a woman with strong religious convictions, had always been emotionally insensitive, and her childhood treatment of Annie sometimes verged on physical and emotional abuse. Although Annie had lived with this treatment for a long time, she reached the breaking point when Betty made a derogatory comment about Annie in front of her colleagues at Annie's award ceremony at work. Annie's feelings were deeply hurt, and she was embarrassed in front of her friends. The insult was so blatant that Annie was sure her mother couldn't deny the wildly inappropriate nature and timing of her comment, as she usually did. But Betty wouldn't take responsibility, coldly denying that what she'd done was problematic. Over the next few days, Annie kept trying to get Betty to understand how hurt she was. She finally wrote a letter to her mother, telling her how she felt and asking her to sit down with her and talk it out. Annie put a great deal of thought into the letter, which was extremely emotionally articulate, in hopes that Betty would see and regret that her behavior had been so chronically insensitive over the years, but Betty didn't offer any response. Emptiness hung between them, along with Annie's impression that her mother couldn't care less. "I want to say to her, 'I'm your daughter,'" Annie cried. "Murderers kill people, and their moms still love them. We're family. She's my mom. How can she just let that go?" This wasn't the first time Annie had tried to reach Betty emotionally. After starting therapy, Annie tried to express herself and work things out in a healthy way whenever her parents were mean or disrespectful toward her. Although Betty routinely dismissed Annie's outreach, she'd always remained in contact so she could see Annie's 3 little boys, but this time it was different. "What I can't get over is that there's nothing coming back, not even anger," Annie said. "All I want is some level of response that shows this matters, even if I've just made her angry." In addition to being wounded, Annie was confused. Although Betty refused to respond, Annie knew her mother was sociable and capable of showing kindness and generosity toward other people. Annie understood that those relationships were more superficial, but this knowledge didn't help her emotionally. "You'd think my mom would have some natural desire to make things better between us, some kind of acknowledgement, or maybe even something through Dad." Annie's sorrow and incomprehension showed on her face. Annie was grieving over not having an emotionally supportive mother, and working through that would take time. But she was also aware that her appeals were making things worse, and it was important to address that too. Annie was confused. She was doing everything she knew to repair the relationship, communicating clearly, making respectful requests, and being emotionally honest. She wondered how they could work anything out without talking about it. "Annie," I said, "you're doing all the right things and trying to make a connection with your mom. You're looking for emotional intimacy with her, which makes perfect sense, but I don't think she can tolerate it. While you think you're just trying to relate, your mom probably sees it as a major threat to her equilibrium. After all, she's been living like this for years. Your openness and honesty are more than she can handle. Think of it as though your mom has a snake phobia. You keep plopping a big, fat, writhing snake right in her lap. She can't stand it, no matter how meaningful it might be to you." Emotional closeness demanded a level of emotional maturity her mother simply didn't have. But her mother's silence made Annie feel like an emotional hostage. She couldn't rest until her mother was happy with her. I told Annie that the only way Betty was going to come around was if Annie stopped talking about her misbehavior and how hurtful it was. Annie needed to find a way forward that didn't involve her mother's participation. That's the only thing that works with parents who are terrified of emotional intimacy. I explained that she could have a relationship with her mother, but it wouldn't be the kind of relationship she yearned for. Her best option was to manage their interactions deliberately rather than seeking emotional intimacy. Annie was open to my suggestions, but still felt confused. She could remember Betty's anguished visits with her own mother, who was also rejecting, when Annie was a child. Betty felt so unloved by her own mother that, after these visits, she was left sobbing with no one to comfort her but Annie. How could she now be doing this to her own daughter? Annie asked. You'd think she'd hate to do that to her own child after she suffered so much. It was a good point, but Betty was just passing her trauma down the line, as people tend to do when they repress their childhood pain. Annie was so intent on winning her mother's approval that she'd stopped evaluating the relationship. She'd never asked herself whether Betty was the type of person she enjoyed being around. Forging a new relationship. The rest of this chapter explores how to handle an emotionally immature parent, as well as other people, by changing your expectations and replacing reactivity with observation. 3 key approaches will help you free yourself from getting caught up in your parents' emotional immaturity: detached observation, maturity awareness, and stepping away from your old role self. Detached observation. The first step in gaining your emotional freedom is to assess whether either of your parents were emotionally immature. Given that you're still reading this book, you've probably decided that at least one of your parents fits that description. Such a parent can probably never fulfill your childhood vision of a loving parent. The only achievable goal is to act from your own true nature, not the role self that pleases your parent. You can't win your parent over, but you can save yourself. For my own understanding of how this works, I'm indebted to family therapist Murray Bowen for his family systems theory, which describes how emotionally immature parents promote emotional enmeshment over individual identity. As a reminder, enmeshment occurs when parents don't respect boundaries, project their unresolved issues onto their children, and get too involved in their children's business. In families dominated by emotionally immature people, enmeshment and playing roles are valued in order to keep the family close. Of course, genuine communication and emotional intimacy are absent in such families. No one's true self is ever acknowledged. Further, in an enmeshed family, if you have a problem with someone, you talk about that person to other people instead of going to the person directly. Bowen called this triangling and characterized enmeshment as the glue that keeps such families together. Bowen also explored how this situation might be remedied, at least for some family members. He found that observation and emotional detachment can give individuals a place to stand outside of their family system. When people keep themselves poised in neutral observation, they can't be hurt or emotionally ensnared by other people's behavior. Becoming observational. When interacting with emotionally immature people, you'll feel more centered if you operate from a calm, thinking perspective rather than emotional reactivity. Start by settling yourself and getting into an observational, detached frame of mind. There are any number of ways to do this. For example, you can count your breaths slowly, tense and relax your muscle groups in a systematic sequence, or imagine calming imagery. Next, your job is to stay detached emotionally and observe how others behave, just like a scientist would. Pretend you're conducting an anthropological field study. What words would you use to describe others' facial expressions? What is their body language communicating? Does their voice sound calm or tense? Do they appear rigid or receptive? How do they respond when you try to relate? What do you find yourself feeling? Can you spot any of the emotionally immature behaviors described in chapters 2 and 3? If you're practicing observing your parent or other loved ones and find yourself getting emotional, your distress is a sign that your healing fantasy has been activated. You've fallen back into believing that you can't be okay if they don't validate you. If you start slipping into your fantasy that you may be able to get the other person to change, you'll feel weak, vulnerable, apprehensive, and needy. This extremely unpleasant feeling of weakness is a signal that you need to shift out of responding emotionally and move back into observing mode. If you find yourself becoming reactive, silently repeat to yourself, detach, detach, detach. Make a point of consciously describing the other person in words, silently and to yourself. During a stressful interaction, this kind of mental narration can center and ground you. Whenever you try to find the exact words to describe something, It helps redirect your brain's energy away from emotional reactivity. The same goes for getting control over your own emotional reactions. Silently narrating your own emotional reactions can give you that extra bit of objectivity that cools things down. If the other person is still getting to you, find an excuse to put some distance between you. Excuse yourself from the room for a bathroom break, play with a pet, take a walk, or run an errand. Gaze out the window and notice nature. If you're interacting on the phone, find a pretext to get off the phone and say you look forward to talking another time. Use whatever excuse you need to take some time to get yourself back into a more detached, observational mindset. As you can see, staying observational isn't passive, it's a very active process. It's also the royal road out of emotional enmeshment. As you practice observing, you'll become stronger and more confident in your ability to see what's really going on, especially now that you have more of an understanding of emotional immaturity. You no longer have to be the upset, helpless child, devastated by potshots from your parent. Your clear mind and observational attitude will keep you strong no matter what the other person does.